Seems good. Okay. So, as the title of the handout indicates, we've gotten to the real Frege now, to where he has his mature view. So, in these essays from 1891, 1892, he emphasizes two distinctions: the distinction between concepts and objects, and the distinction between sense and reference. And the sense and reference is a new one. The concepts and objects, or functions and objects, because concepts are a special kind of function. That had been in play sort of all along from the Begriffsschrift, but he emphasizes it in the Grundlagen. He says one of his three principles is not ever to confuse concepts with objects. I should say, in order to pick out the species of function that he identifies with concepts, you have to pick out a special set of objects, the truth values, since concepts are functions that have truth values as their values. And he emphasizes, particularly in the short comments on USB essay, that these are orthogonal distinctions, that for both concept expressions and object expressions, we can distinguish between their sense and, I'll try and say Bedeutung rather than reference. Just leave it in the German as a sort of black box notion to be contextually defined by what he says about it. We know that you can do an incredible amount if you don't make, in semantics, if you don't make these distinctions. So the tradition that goes from the Tractatus through Carnap until the 1940s, Tarski, and culminating in Quine, doesn't distinguish between functions and objects in any sense Frege would recognize. It just uses objects in place of his functions and concepts. Its notion of predicates is a kind of Fregean object, what he calls courses of values. So you can do Tarskian model theory entirely with objects in the domain and courses of values of predicative expressions. And all of that, furthermore, is for Frege on the side of Bedeutung. So that tradition, Tarski and Quine, there isn't anything recognizable as sense at all there. I would say that the Fregean notion of function, by and large, has not been exploited in Anglophone semantic theory. The notion of sense certainly has, and I want to say something about that, sort of the 1980s take on Fregean sense. Hilary Putnam is the main protagonist here, or anyway, a central one. And it understood some things, and I want to say there's some things it didn't understand, and that we ought to go beyond it. But first, we haven't really talked about the concept and object essay, the one in which he insists that the concept horse is not a concept. I'm thinking of the Chinese philosopher who claims that a white horse is not a horse, but sort of by analogy to this, but the arguments, the considerations are quite different in that case. And Frege talks about this distinction to begin with, in expressions, between complete and incomplete expressions. And one of the things that's less than perspicuous about his discussion is he sort of goes back and forth between talking about function expressions and object expressions on the one hand, and functions and objects on the other hand, which are in the realm of Bedeutung, of these expressions. And it's often more puzzling when he talks about functions as concepts, as incomplete or unsaturated, as needing completion in order to, what? He's thinking of them, he's inviting us to think of them as something like objects with holes in them that need to be filled in order to get a full object. And this is really puzzling. There is a contemporary line of thought that takes this very seriously. If you look at the discussion in the contemporary metaphysics literature about the intelligibility of asymmetric relations, Kit Fine, as usual, has the sort of inaugural essay, the one that sets the debate here. But if you're thinking about relations as sort of things in the world, the question of what it can mean for them to have argument places that correspond in some sense to the argument places of the expressions. In the expressions, we separate these as ordered tuples that they apply to, and say, well, a singular term appearing in the first argument place is doing something different than a singular term appearing in the second argument place. And now if we're trying to think about the worldly correlates of this, what corresponds to these argument places? That's a puzzling sort of thing. Here I think the beginning of wisdom is Dummett's distinction, I mentioned before, between simple predicates and complex predicates. The simple predicates are the bits of language that we concatenate in order to make sentences, at least if we're doing it in a one-dimensional notation. So we have this expression P, so capital P, and say, well, you need to combine that with two singular term expressions to get PAB, to express a relation, to say that A admires B or that A killed B. The P that we use there, the killed, the admired, that's an actual part of the sentence. It's an expression. But if you want to codify inferences, you've got to cut finer than those simple or primitive predicates, the ones that are parts of sentences. And Dummett says the complex predicates, the one that Frege was the first one to realize, you had to distinguish multiple complex predicates that correspond to or are expressed by the appearance in the sentence of the same simple predicate. Dummett's helpful characterization of that is that complex predicates are not parts of sentences, they're patterns in sentences. And the issue here is that if that we need to distinguish the notion of admiration that occurs in sentences like Rousseau admired Rousseau and Descartes admired Descartes, that are expressing self-admiration, where the admirer and the admired one are the same. We need to distinguish that predicate in its inferential behavior from what corresponds to, from the complex predicate that corresponds to the same simple predicate of admiration, where it isn't required that the one admired be the same as the one who's an admirer. And the trouble is that there isn't any part of the sentences Rousseau admired Rousseau and Descartes admired Descartes that isn't also a part of the sentence Kant admired Hamann, for instance. We need to distinguish the simple predicate, the complex predicate of self-admiration from the complex predicate of admiration to cour, because inferentially, all self-admirers are admirers, but it's not the case that all admirers are self-admirers. So if we look at the inferential relations between these predicates, the sort of thing that we'll make explicit with quantified conditionals, anyone who admires himself admires someone, that's true, but it's not true that anyone who admires someone admires himself. So these things behave differently as premises and conclusions of implications. And so if we're interested in codifying those, we've got to distinguish these patterns rather than pieces of the expressions. We've got to identify predicates that aren't really parts of the expressions. What's expressing the predicate is, Dummett says usefully, a pattern rather than a piece of the expression. Now, I think it's helpful to think about this at the level of expressions. Still we say, well, a pattern, what's that? What do you mean by that? He says, well, I mean the identity and individuation, the cross-referencing between the argument places. So I can have a 17-place predicate where it's required that the second, third, and 14th argument place be occupied by the same singular term. That's a perfectly good complex predicate. Because, well, that's a pattern that requires the cross-identification of those singular terms. But still, what is a pattern? And I suggest that we think about it as subscripting the sentence by an equivalence class of other sentences. The equivalence class of all the sentences that sentence can be turned into by uniform replacement of one singular term by another. So what's different about the equivalence class corresponding to Rxy, that is where we allow X and Y to be different, that's going, if let's say R is admiration, that's going to have things in it like, if we start off with the sentence Kant admires Rousseau, it's going to have in it all the self-admiration sentences Descartes admired. Descartes is in the equivalence class that you can turn that one into by uniformly substituting Descartes for Kant and uniformly substituting Descartes for Rousseau. You can turn Kant admired Rousseau into Descartes admired Descartes. You can't go the other way around. There isn't a uniform substitution of one singular term for all the occurrences of another singular term. That's uniform substitution that will turn Descartes admired Descartes into Kant admired Rousseau. The complex predicate of being a self-admirer only has things of the form Rxx in it. You can pick any one of these instances and think of the predicate that it exhibits, the pattern that it's an instance of, as it's being a member of this equivalence class, the equivalence class that for shorthand we could say is Rxx, whereas the predicate in Kant admired Rousseau, the Rxx predicate, we can think of that as as corresponding to a different equivalence class of substitutional variants of that sentence. It will include all the sentences that are substitutional variants of Descartes admired Descartes, but it'll have a lot more as well. It will have, Hegel admired Plato, Aristotle admired Plato, and so on. I'm sort of trying to say only true ones, but all the false ones will be in there. Will be in there as well. But rather than thinking of functional expressions in general as having holes in them that need to be filled, think of them as corresponding to this equivalence class, and what corresponds to filling the hole in it is picking one of the instances, one of the substitutional variants. So the complex predicates I encourage you to think of as identical to, or anyway corresponding to, the substitutional equivalence classes that the sentence we're starting with can be turned into by uniform substitution of singular terms for singular terms that are in that sentence. Now, what will happen to that when we try and think about the worldly correlates of these, that's another matter. But when Frege says, look, you've got to distinguish between complete expressions and these incomplete ones, it's because the incomplete ones really are whole sets of expressions. And the same sentence can be a member of different sets of these, as Descartes admired Descartes is a member both of the RXX complex predicate and the RXY complex predicate. But Kant admired Rousseau is only a member of the RXY equivalence class, not the RXX one. So I propose that as a way of understanding what Dummett means by saying it's not a piece or a part of the expression, the complex predicate isn't. It's rather a pattern that it exhibits. Well, it's sort of the ordered pair of the expression and the set of substitutional variants of it, which all intuitively exhibit the same complex predicate. Instead of talking about cross-references and identities of argument places, just talk about this set of sentences. Which substitutions can turn this sentence in the equivalence class into this other one? It's important if you think about this, that uniform substitution is an equivalence relation, that swapping all the A's for B's, well, if you're swapping all the A's for A's, you get the same sentence. It's reflexive. If you swap all the A's for B's and then swap all the B's for A's, that's a symmetric relation. It's transitive if you swap all the A's for B's and swap all the B's for C's. That's the same as swapping all the A's for C's. So it's an equivalence relation. So we can think of the complex predicates as formed by abstraction from the sentences, where the equivalence relation is an intersubstitution equivalence relation. And we know Frege is already thinking about those substitutional equivalence classes. So let me stop there. I hope to have demystified somewhat, at least on the side of the expressions, what Frege could be on about in saying you must not confuse single expressions with expressions paired with a whole equivalence class of expressions. Those are different things. The sentence qua or as a member of this equivalence class, that is, as exhibiting this pattern, that's different from the sentence as exhibiting this other pattern as a member of this other equivalence relation. We don't have to think about, well, what are the complete things? Well, we start with the sentences and we've got singular terms. Now singular terms can occur in other singular terms, so we can talk about, a function expression whose arguments are singular terms and whose values are singular terms, like father of, for instance. But in each case, the function is best thought of as an equivalence class of the sentences that result from doing these substitutions. So let me stop there and ask, are we okay with that point? Is that helpful in thinking about at least expressions as sort of having holes in them? And so I think that makes sense of Dummett saying they're not parts of sentences, they're patterns in them. Patterns are just the equivalence classes. We're sort of subscripting the expression with or relativizing it to. And I think it makes sense of Frege wanting to say, look, nothing can be both of these. It's either the expressions you sort of start with, or it's those tagged with equivalence classes of expressions like that, each of which can be turned into any other one in the equivalence class by uniform substitution of some other complete expression. He says these are just completely different kinds of things. Don't run them together. He's showing us another way of doing abstraction to get courses of values, which are objects corresponding to these functions. Course of values expressions are complete. You can substitute in them. You can substitute them for other ones of them, which you really can't for complex predicates. You can substitute simple predicates for simple predicates, and that's important if we're going to do higher order, look at higher order concepts. But these are just different kinds of things. It is a remarkable metaphysical leap to say, well, there are going to be worldly correlates of both of these kinds of expression, complete expressions and functional expressions. And furthermore, this division is not just a division into mutually exclusive classes. It's a huge metaphysical jump to say this is also an exhaustive classification of worldly items. What there is must be either what you can pick out with a complete expression, an object. So we've got to find objects for the complete expressions that are sentences. And that's what singular terms do. Or it's a function, including the special kind of function that's a concept. That's anything there is that isn't referred to either by a sentence or by a singular term, the complete expressions he acknowledges. There are things among what there is, I shouldn't say things, among what there is, we can count not only the worldly correlates of singular terms and sentences, but also the worldly correlates of functional expressions, at least all the functional expressions that can figure in true claims. Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
I was
John.
thinking that maybe this metaphysical leap can be deflated a bit, because I guess Frege would decline to officially state the view as involving a single quantifier that's going to range over the functions and the objects. He's not going to want to say, there are things, or among what there is, there are objects and functions. He's going to rather say there are objects, and he's going to use a second order quantifier to say there are functions. And I guess I'm thinking, well, if you're happy with second order quantification in general, then you will be able to say that. But it doesn't seem like introducing second order quantification by itself, like doing second order logic, commits you to strange metaphysical views.
Right. For instance, I mean, he says, look in the Grundlagen, because, in the Grundgesetze, where we're really doing logic, we only care about truth. You can do just with the courses of values. You can treat two functions as behaving in the same way as far as his concavity, which, as you say, his concavity in effect the quantifier, though he uses the same expression, whether what it's in effect quantifying over is objects or functions. Any one instance of it either binds singular term positions or binds second order things. It's important to him that he uses the same expression for this, but he also is keeping separate sets of books on them, just as John said. And if all you care about is truth and preservation of truth, as will be true in the Grundgesetze, he says, you can just deal with the courses of values. If two functions have the same extensions, they'll be treated the same way in his second order scheme. Now, this is a little bit disingenuous on his part, because it's crucial to him that though the only things that are referred to in the perspicuous language of Grundgesetze, which is just an expansion of the Begriffsschrift language, the only things that are referred to are objects, including courses of values. But the two-dimensional expressions are supposed to show you the senses. They don't ever refer to senses. You don't manipulate senses as items of any kind. In Grundgesetze, he elsewhere is happy to talk about functions that have senses as arguments and as values, but that's not the language of Grundgesetze. That's him commenting on it. But it is the case that Grundgesetze is supposed to show us the different senses that correspond to the same courses of values. So it's just that it shows us, rather than representing, that the Bedeutungen of expressions of Grundgesetze can be read entirely as the courses of values of the expressions, that is, just in terms of objects. So, this is a delicate enterprise he's engaged in. German word Eiertanz, a dance on eggs. You have to be very careful not to put a foot wrong. Okay. The orthogonal distinction is the one that's new, the distinction between sense, Sinn, and Bedeutung. The Bedeutungen are going to be what matters for truth. There's actually two principles, I think, involved in each of these, really. He tells us that, and this passage, I think, well, anyway, it's in the excerpts that we have there. He says, in the Grundlagen, I wasn't yet distinguishing between sense and Bedeutung. I hadn't split up the notion of begrifflich Inhalt into these two parts. And so I was running together what I would now call a thought and a truth value for sentences. So we have his notion of content, and that gets split into Sinn and Bedeutung. And he says, I confused these before, and so we want to see sort of how can we understand that confusion afterwards. But each of these actually has two substantially different aspects to it. And this, I mentioned, at least label these on the handout. On the side of Bedeutung, on the side of Bedeutung, we have the name bearer. Relation. So, yeah. Yeah, the bedeutung of a proper name is the object it designates or names, he says. That's the first thing he says. So this I talked about last time as the Fido picture, that I'll just write BD for bedeutung of the bedeutung of quoted expression just is that. This is Fido, and this is Fido the dog. I've used Quinian corner quotes here. This is a nicety, and it doesn't really matter here, but in case you've never seen it or need to be reminded of it, it's just, if I just wrote that, that's a name of the 20th letter of the alphabet, not a name of Fido, even if T is a variable that refers to Fido. So what you can say is use these corner quotes, and they say, take the expression T, substitute whatever T stands for, and then quote it, instead of just quoting the variable, which, as I say, just gives you a quote name of the 20th letter of the alphabet. Is that okay? Corner quotes? That's it. Sometimes you want to be fussy about these things. When you do, that's a good way. So this is an instance of this, where T equals Fido. And then the bedeutung of quote Fido, the expression, the bedeutung of that is Fido. That's an operationalization of what I'm calling the name bearer model. And that's what motivates people to say, well, bedeutung just is the referent, ENT, of an expression. But in that very same passage, this is from the comments on USB, I extracted a bunch of passages and put them on the website here. He goes on to say, I may clarify this by drawing attention to a fact that seems to weigh heavily on the side of extensionalists as opposed to intentionalist logicians. Interesting side question. Who in the world is he talking about in 1890s Germany here? I think Boole is the extensionalist. I think Lotze is the intentionalist. Hermann Lotze is the intentionalist. But this isn't something I know a great deal about. So he's clarifying the sentence that the bedeutung of a proper name is the object it designates or names. In any sentence, we can substitute salva veritate, saving the truth, one concept word for another if they have the same extension. So it's also the case that in relation to inference and where the laws of logic are concerned, concepts differ only insofar as their extensions are different. Skipping down a little. Therefore, just as proper names can replace one another salva veritate, So can concept words if their extension is the same. Well, this is what I mean by the other thing is being intersubstitutable, salva veritate. So a big V here. It's not obvious that these are the same. These are two aspects of the notion of Bedeutung. He moves smoothly back and forth from the one to the other, and a justification for it, I think, the way he's thinking about it is, well, I'm really relativizing this claim to a notion of the occurrence of, say, a singular term in a sentence. Call it the primary occurrence of a singular term in a sentence or in another singular term, and just stipulating that I'm not going to say that the one expression occurs in the other expression, so that you can substitute for it, unless intersubstitution is salva veritate, that is, in the Quinean language, unless the context is an extensional context. And the justification for this is, well, there are substitutions where you don't want to say that the one word occurs in the other. I can take the word cattle and substitute bat and rat for cat and get rattle and battle. If I substitute cat, I can get kettle in there. Those are not real substitutions because the word cat doesn't in the relevant sense occur in the word cattle, and bat doesn't occur in battle, and rat doesn't occur in rattle. Why not? Well, you could say because you can't substitute co-referential terms salva veritate. So there is a non-trivial way of sort of making this true. That's what Quine does when he starts from the bottom and says, well, I know, let's suppose, what the referent of these singular terms is, what object they refer to, and I'm only going to allow that the singular term occurs in contexts if substituting co-referential terms preserves the truth of the larger sentence in which it occurs. But at any rate, conceptually and to begin with, we should distinguish those two roles that Bedeutung plays in Frege's story. People had not paid much attention to the second one as sort of essential to the notion of Bedeutung. It was Ernst Tugendhat who really pushed this line and said, really forget about the name bearer part of this. Think about intersubstitutability salva veritate. That's the core of the notion of Bedeutung. And now we can ask whether and under what circumstances it's going to be sensible to think of the name bearer model as a model for at least some of those, Bedeutungen. And we Anglophone readers of Frege mostly only know about this work because Dummett took it very, very seriously. Tugendhat's stuff was never translated, I believe still has not been translated into English. Some of his writings in practical philosophy have, but even though he was of his generation, perhaps the German philosopher most important for setting up conversation between Anglophone analytic people and German philosophers. For instance, the German translations of standard analytic philosophy of language terms like indexical, demonstrative, and so on, those are all due to Tugendhat. So small pitch for him there. He was invited to give the Locke lectures at Oxford. Dummett, I'm sure, was the source of that. And begged off the first time, said, can I wait a year? I'm not ready to do it. And then begged off the second time, and they said, okay. So he never actually gave the Locke lectures, which would have come out in English, and we would have had those. Okay, but there's also two sides to the notion of Zinn, one of which is what I'll call cognitive value. Well, that's what Frege calls it, Erkenntniswerte. And the other is, as Frege says, that senses contain modes of presentation of Bedeutung. So one of the claims is sentences or other locutions express senses, and the senses contain modes of presentation of Bedeutung. So first of all, for Frege strictly, it's not the word Fido that refers to Fido. The word Fido expresses some sense, and the sense is what has a Bedeutung. Fido's a bad example because real proper names, as opposed to singular terms in general, aren't the best case for the way he's thinking about this. But Sinne have modes of presentation I'm sorry, this is a right-only language. You have to remember what I said when I scribbled there. Modes of presentation is a good enough translation of his Art des Gegebensein, the way in which something is given, literally. And he's happy to say objects are given in that way, but Bedeutung in general. And this is from the opening of On Sense and Reference. He's giving his analysis of why there's a difference in cognitive value between identities of the form A equals B and identities of the form A equals A. And he says, it's natural now to think of their being connected with a sign, a name, a combination of words, or a letter, besides that to which the sign refers, it's Bedeutung, which may be called the Bedeutung of the sign, also what I should like to call the sense of the sign, wherein the mode of presentation is contained. And he gives a geometrical example, very like the one he gave in the Begriffsschrift. We have a triangle, and we draw a line bisecting one of the sides, and then a line bisecting the other side, and we call that point A. And now it's a theorem that if we draw the third one, the point of intersection of it with both of those will be the same. We can pick that point out either as the intersection of those two or as the intersection of those two. Those are different modes of presentation of the same thing. He says that's his example. He says, in our example, accordingly, the reference of the expressions, the point of intersection of A and B and the point of intersection of B and C would be the same, but not their senses. And next sentence, the reference of evening star would be the same as that of morning star, but not the sense. So there he's introducing the notion of sense by individuating them by modes of presentation. And it's crucial that he says the mode of presentation is contained in the sense. I want to say that that's important for two reasons. He's not identifying the sense with the mode of presentation. He's saying the sense contains a mode of presentation. And it can't be then that he's thinking of that. Well, I'll leave that point. I'll leave that point away. Anyway, I want to really emphasize that notion that senses contain modes of presentation. Now, the cognitive value side, there's a parallel between this and this. So we identify and individuate Bedeutungen by starting with the expressions. Let's just say we're starting with singular terms. And having the same Bedeutung, the Bedeutung of expression A is the same as the Bedeutung of expression B, just in case A can be substituted for B uniformly or B uniformly for A. Everywhere where it occurs or has primary occurrence, salva veritate, saving the truth value of it. Having the same truth value of a sentence, that's an equivalence relation. Expression A and expression B having the same Bedeutung. Think of line A and line B having the same direction. We define the directions by abstraction from an equivalence relation, and the equivalence relation is an intersubstitution relation saving the truth value. That's that side of Bedeutungen. And we do exactly the same thing for senses, only it's cognitive value rather than truth value. It's not Wahrheitswerte, but Erkenntniswerte. Same notion of value. We've got truth values and we've got cognitive values. Now, what is a cognitive value? That's a really important question. But two expressions have the same Sinn, the same sense, just in case uniformly substituting one for the other never changes the cognitive value of the sentences in which they have, well, primary occurrence. So both of those are introducing a new kind of sortal and class of singular terms by abstraction, the way he taught us to think clearly about abstraction for the first time in the Grundlagen. But this is his method. So we introduce the new kind of thing, well, new in our discourse, Bedeutungen, by defining an equivalence class on expressions. They have, these expressions have, or their senses have, but we've got to start with the expressions, have the same Bedeutung, just in case substituting one for the other never turns a true claim into a false one. That is, in case it never changes the truth value of it. And exactly parallel for senses, only what's preserved under substitution, this overarching methodology of noting invariance under substitution, which is always for him intersubstitution. But what's preserved is different. It's cognitive value rather than truth value. I mean, we talked last time or the time before a little bit about truth values. That's where the slingshot argument came in, and thinking about why we should think of what we could now say is the Bedeutung of sentences as being truth values. But we can see truth values are introduced as, by abstraction, truth value as a sortal kind term that only has two singular terms that fall under it, two canonical singular terms that fall under it, the true and the false. The equivalence relation is P is equivalent in the relevant sense to Q in case either they're both true or they're both false. So he's using assessments of truth in order to define an object, the true, which is the Bedeutung of all the true sentences, just the way we define the direction of a line by giving us a notion of parallelism. So the analogy I want to, that this line is supposed to mark is they're formed by abstraction. And it's either abstraction saving CVs or TVs, truth values, cognitive values. He uses parallel expressions for these, Wahrheitswerte and Erkenntniswerte, to sort of emphasize this parallelism. So I say, there's obviously questions about the notion of truth values, but we can see how they're introduced by abstraction. For cognitive values, well, they're introduced in the same way. Two things have the same cognitive value, have the same sense if substituting one for the other never changes the cognitive value of sentences involved. But what's a cognitive value? That's what we have to understand. What's the parallel on the side of sense to the truth values on the side of Bedeutung? So we'd like to understand the distinction between sense and reference, sense and Bedeutung, the first divide there, and then how are the two aspects of each of those notions. The one we can see is formed by abstraction, but relative to these dark, so far dark notion of cognitive value on the side of sense. But how are these two sides related? And now this is a topic that was much controverted in the 1980s. As I mentioned, Putnam. Putnam's version of the two sides of sense, which he's breaking not for the first time with his colleague Quine, in so much as worrying about senses, but he says the notion of sense, Frege's notion of sense, is being asked to do two incompatible jobs. He's saying you can't actually reconcile the two sides of senses here. Now, he's not doing this as a matter of Frege exegesis, but he means his account to apply to Frege and to derive from these two aspects of the notion of sense. And because of the debate downstream from Putnam's discussion, people thought really hard about these two aspects on the side of sense, in a way maybe that they didn't about the two sides of Bedeutung. But I'll come round sort of closer to the end to talk about the Bedeutung, and sort of the new thing is the senses, and that's what we most want to get clear about. So here's Putnam's version of those two sides of senses, of Sinne. He says, on the one hand, sense determines reference. He says senses are supposed to be modes of presentation of reference. Let's stay with singular terms for a bit and say they're supposed to be modes of presentation of objects, which are the objects referred to. Now they said, when we do care about the exegesis, Frege doesn't actually say that senses are modes of presentation. He says they contain them. And that's not a distinction that Putnam is making. But as I say, Putnam's point is not about Frege, it's about sort of the phenomena. So he says, one job that the notion of sense is supposed to be doing is determining what the referent is. It's thinking of it as performing that job that we're invoking when we think about intentions with an S rather than extensions. The intention together with some index determines an extension. It was always puzzling to people that Frege doesn't include room for an index there, as we might think, well, the meaning together with the way the world is, determines what you're referring to or the truth of the claim. And it's striking that Frege doesn't ever mention anything other than the senses. The senses contain modes of presentation, facts not mentioned, no other parameter is involved. But here's one job. If you think about the content of your term water or gold, the content is supposed to determine what you're talking about, what the referent of those terms is. That's one job that corresponds to the mode of presentation side. The other one, he says, the one that corresponds to cognitive value is the sense is what you grasp when you understand the expression. And cognitive value is something like the role in your conceptual economy that what's expressed by that expression plays. So you have a conception of water. That's what you understand by the term when somebody utters it, or when you're having a water thought. What you have a grip on is the sense. So we might worry, Frege sometimes does, whether you associate the same sense with some set of words that I do. If not, on Frege's account, there's going to be an issue about communication, but for him, if we can still refer to the same things, that's good enough. And that, of course, was Quine's response when, at the end of the classic Two Dogmas of Empiricism, he says, well, the role of a sentence, the meaning of a sentence is its role in the entire web of belief. Your web of belief is different from mine, so we're not going to share meanings. But that doesn't mean that the extension of my concept, white, can't be the same as yours, and what I'm referring to when I say snow can't be the same thing you're referring to. At the level of reference, we can understand each other and let the meanings go by. We scientists, Quine says, only care about truth and reference. So let's just do all of our semantics at that level. But now Putnam is concerned, well, what is it that what is the shape of your conception that you associate with a sentence, snow is white, or with the concepts that are involved in it, or the singular term when I say Fido is a dog. There's a sense that goes with dog, a mode of presentation of that concept. For him, the concept dog, that's a worldly item. The concept is the Bedeutung of that, but it has a sense too, the grip, what dogs are for you, what you understand by the term. Putnam has got relatively clear readings of the two aspects of sense. He says sense determines reference. Frege never says that, but senses do contain modes of presentation. And one way to see that morning star and evening star have different senses, though they have the same referent, is to see the mode of presentation of the planet Venus is different in the first heavenly body you can see in the morning that becomes visible in the morning, and the last heavenly body, that you can see. And these are different modes of presentation of the same object. So Putnam's got sense determines reference, and by cognitive value, he's looking at Frege saying, look, somebody might not know that the morning star was the evening star. That was an astronomical discovery, though it was a discovery a long time ago. Everybody who ever wrote about it that we have to read knew that, but it had to be discovered at some point. But nobody ever thought that the morning star wasn't the morning star, or the evening star wasn't the evening star. So there's a difference in cognitive value. Well, Putnam's saying that's what you understand by that expression. And then, famous title of one of Putnam's classic papers, meanings ain't in the head, he says. What you grasp when you understand some concept doesn't determine what it refers to. And he introduces the twin earth thought experiment for exactly this purpose, and says, imagine the world that's qualitatively identical to this one, but the chemical composition of the watery stuff that falls down when it rains and that you find in ponds and streams and that quenches your thirst when you drink it is XYZ, not H2O. If you were transported to this other possible world, you could take with you your understanding of water and nothing would go amiss, even though in that world, when people use the word water, it actually refers to XYZ, not to H2O. And people worried, well, what does your word mean if you're transported there? Well, okay. Over time, does it converge or does it swap to meaning this? Anyway, he says, these twin earth examples show that you can hold cognitive value fixed and change something out there that you're causally interacting with, but where the difference between what you're causally interacting with in that world and here doesn't penetrate to your understanding of it. Now, of course, there's a huge literature on these examples. It was immediately clear that you shouldn't have used water. I can't be a particle for particle duplicate. There, I'm mostly water. Am I XYZ or not? And conceptually, so all right, talk about gold, assuming there's no gold atoms in my body, which is also false. But he thought, look, if we're talking about particle by particle duplicates, then the role that some expression plays in the cognitive economy of that thinker and talker must be the same. We saw conceptually, well, when you say particle by particle duplicate, one of the properties my particles have is being 2 feet from a water bottle, from a bottle containing water. And I wouldn't have my particles wouldn't have that property in the XYZ world. They wouldn't be 2 feet from H2O, they would only be 2 feet from XYZ. Well, no, I mean intrinsic properties, well, that's all very well. If you can just tell me how to tell those from these relational properties, then we can get on with this. There are conceptual issues about the twin Earth examples. The first sort of move that was made in this tradition was to say, well, we've got to distinguish between narrow content and wide content. Narrow content is what it is just in virtue of the role it plays in bringing about utterances on your part, whereas wide content includes causal relations to things. And it turns out, this was the sort of discovery in the 70s and 80s, that the content of your claim, what you're referring to, can depend on causal relations to things that don't make any difference to your behavior, at least described in a suitably restricted vocabulary. Now, I think at the end of that discussion by the early 80s, and John McDowell was a big player in making this happen, when the dust had settled to that extent, the conclusion was the notion of narrow content doesn't make any sense. Content is wide content. The content of what you're thinking would be different if the things you were thinking about were different. But this leads to the famous McDowellian paradox that I would be having different thoughts in twin Earth. The only thing, he says, that my thought on twin Earth about gold, let's say the gold is some other thing there, the only thing that my gold thoughts here share with my gold thoughts on twin Earth is that I can't tell them apart. They don't share a semantic content. But in that sense, you don't always know what you're thinking. We have to give up a certain transparency assumption about our own thoughts. And the challenge is to say, well, how can you really think with them if there can be differences among thoughts that you actually have? Putnam is actually having different beech thoughts than he's having elm thoughts, even though he can't tell beeches from elms and knows nothing about one that he doesn't know about the other. But, how can that be? We're off to the races. How is the reference of our terms fixed? But Putnam made the point that there's at least one way of conceiving what your understanding of the concept expressed by your words is, in which that doesn't settle what you're talking about. So if you want to say that sense does determine reference, or at least that senses contain modes of presentation of the reference, do we have to say that you don't always know what the cognitive value of your expressions is, that the senses are not transparent to you? And I think the short answer is yes, we have to say that. Okay, now, I think that there were confusions baked deeply into that discussion around Putnam in the 80s, and those still matter in our thinking today. We haven't shaken ourselves free of the confusions that were in that, but I think that's a helpful background for thinking about what's actually going on in Frege's use of sense and Bedeutung, where we would like to reconcile the claim that differences in cognitive value are differences of sense. That is, that if two expressions have the same sense, then they can be interchanged, saving the cognitive value of the larger expressions they occur in. And the claim that senses, the things that are identified and individuated by cognitive value, or whatever that is, contain modes of presentation of objects. Let me mention one other tradition, sort of triangulating on this issue. People say, well, the cognitive value, it seems like he's saying, look, you could know perfectly well that the morning star is the morning star and still not know that the morning star is the evening star, even though the morning star is the evening star, but you might not know that. They have different cognitive values. So for you, you wouldn't be able to intersubstitute those expressions, saving the cognitive value where that's measured by whether you believe it or not. So we're thinking about these epistemic possibilities. Putnam is giving an epistemic reading of cognitive value. Well, it's erkenntniswerte, that means knowledge. Giving an epistemic reading of that seems sensible enough. But then people ask themselves, well, so what expressions are interchangeable, saving the fact that you could not believe true a sentence that had the one expression and believe false the sentence that had the other expression. What terms are synonymous in the sense that they're intersubstitutable such that one could not have a belief expressed with the one and not have the belief expressed with the other. And where that's, in some sense, not a psychological impossibility, but an epistemological or at least epistemic one. And this led in the circle around Geach in the late 50s and early 60s, as they're reading these essays, to say, well, so what words in English are synonymous in that sense? And Geach actually found a pair, which he claimed were probably the only words that are synonymous in English in this sense. And people have been making fun of this ever since. The first word is furs, and the second word is gorse. You could be forgiven if you've never heard of either of these words. They're two Scots terms for the plants that grow in the sort of heather that grows on the fields, and you can call it either furs or gorse. And they said yes. Now this seems, maybe they are synonymous, but nobody knows what either of them means. So, what do you have here? Alonzo Church showed how difficult it's going to be to get two things that are interchangeable according to this epistemic criterion. He says it's not just could you believe P without believing Q, because we can embed that belief in something else. So he suggested as a test, no one has ever doubted that everyone who believed that furs was heather has believed that gorse was heather. No one has ever doubted that everyone who believed the one believed the other. And he says, now that's going to be really tough to get two expressions that can satisfy that Alonzo Church test. And if you did get them, well, pile on a few more propositional attitude ascribing locutions, and you're really going to be able to separate any things that have, different linguistic expressions. Yeah, John?
Is the criterion of sameness of cognitive value a normative sort of thing? Like, you would be irrational to believe the one thing without believing the other? Or is it descriptive? I mean, I'm thinking, well, if it's descriptive, then sure, that your stuff seems fine. But if it's normative, well, then sure, what it is to doubt this would just be to doubt that some people are, that everyone is always rational. But like, you can doubt that.
Yeah, I mean, Church is clearly reading it in a psychological sense. I mean, the norms about doubting are less serious than the norms about believing, though, you know, people thought it's a serious question whether Descartes was violating the norms governing doubting. Do they actually underwrite radical doubt in the sense that he wanted? But yeah, and Putnam has a psychological sort of reading of this as well, right? Two things mean the same thing for you, have the same cognitive value for you if believing the one is for you the same thing as believing the other, even if maybe that's not true for other people. That's the way he's thinking about it. And, as maybe is clear, I don't think Frege doesn't care about psychology, right? That's not what he's talking about. That can't be cognitive value for him. So, what is cognitive value? What are cognitive values? What are modes of presentation? And in what sense do senses contain modes of presentation? And when we come back after the break, I want to give answers to those things using Frege's own concepts. I think there's pretty definite answers that we can give to this. And if you understand properly what a mode of presentation is for him, and understand properly the sense in which senses contain modes of presentation, I'm going to say they're structured constellations of modes of presentation. But if you understand that properly, then there's a natural Fregean reading of cognitive value, broadly in inferential terms. So the reading I'm going to offer says, when Sinn and Bedeutung got split up, we still did everything using the method of noting invariance under intersubstitution. But over here, it was salva veritate, and over here, it was salva consequentiae. That is, preserving inferential role, the original notion, falls down and becomes part of sense. I mean, he drew conclusions in the Griffschrift about truth and truth values as well, but now we're going to have to understand that in terms of the things that we identify and individuate for the purposes of abstracting senses from them, assimilating them accordingly as they have the same sense, by sameness of inferential role. We've got to understand what that has to do with determining the Bedeutung in the sense of Bedeutungen that are identified and individuated by intersubstitutability, saving the truth value, salva veritate. How did he do that? Says, how could inferential role split up into role with respect to truth and role with respect to inference? Computation. It's the computational inferential role and the truth inferential role. I mean, computation isn't one of his words. His word is function, but we know there are deep connections between functions and computations. So that's the analogy that I'm going to try and fill in. So it's slightly earlier than I usually get to the break, but it's 2020. It's 2:20. Let's come back at 2:35. So I'd like to give an interpretation that satisfies the criteria of adequacy I was indicating before. Start with a reading of what a mode of presentation is for Frege. Say, on the basis of that, what senses are that contain modes of presentation. Explain in terms of that what cognitive values are. So I think a mode of presentation is a way of computing a value. That is, a mode of presentation is a function and the arguments of that function, such that when you apply that function to the arguments, the value is the Bedeutung. So a mode of presentation is just a function, and for this purpose we can think about just the monadic ones will be fine. A function and an argument such that applying that function to the argument has the Bedeutung as the value. So what's his paradigm here? He says the intersection of lines A and B is identical to the intersection of lines B and C. One mode of presentation is the intersection of lines A and B. The other mode of presentation is the intersection of lines B and C. You can have an informative identity if you say those values are the same. That f of AB equals g of BC. That's an identity sign flanked by two modes of presentation. If you think of the morning star as a definite description, the last heavenly body you can still see as the sun is rising, and the evening star as a definite description, the first heavenly body that you can see as the sun sets, then they have this form. Definite descriptions are formed by applying functions to arguments. You have to show that there is a value, and that if one thing is the value and another thing is, then they're identical. Yeah, for definite descriptions you have to do that. We could call these functions applied to arguments. And a good name for that is just a computation. You compute the value by applying a function to an argument. The Bedeutungen are the values. The modes of presentation are ways of computing the value in the technical sense, where a computation just is the application of a function to arguments in order to yield a value that's the result of the computation. Now, Frege certainly has that conception in play. Indeed, he's gone to great lengths to get clear about what functions are and what he means by applying them to arguments and so on. So he certainly can help himself to that notion. And my first suggestion is that's all he means by mode of presentation. Out des Gegebenseins, the way it's given, well, the way it's determined by applying a function to an argument. And that's consonant with the examples that he gives to it. Now, notice, neither the function nor an argument is contained in the value. We can apply as a mode of presentation of Stockholm, I can say it's the capital of Sweden. I'm giving you an argument capital of, a function capital of, an argument Sweden. and the value of that is Stockholm, and Sweden is not part of Stockholm, and neither is the capital of part of that value. But there is a way to go from the function and the argument to determine the value. We can think of applying that function to that argument as a way of presenting the value. But here presenting is just computing, determining the result of applying the function to the argument. Now, thinking about it this way is going to connect to a lot of contemporary thought in computer science, but I'm going to do the Frege interpretation here. Now, what is a sense, then, which contains one of these computations? A fata, function applied to argument, just an acronym for function applied to argument. That's what a mode of presentation is, a function applied to argument, a fata, or just call it a computation, a functional computation. Part of the function and the argument are part of the mode of presentation. They're not part of the value, but they are part of the mode of presentation. And that computation, f of a, when we say f of a equals b, the computation does not contain the value. It presents it or computes it. The computation is the function and the argument or arguments. I mean, we can see how one mode of presentation could be part of another mode of presentation. If I say, well, g of f of a is b, then f of a is going to be literally a part of the mode of presentation of g of so I'm saying the general form is f of a. That's a function applied to an argument. But that has a value as well, the value b. And now we could say, well, we can get another mode of presentation. G of f of a is c. And now this mode of presentation is literally a part of this mode of presentation. The one computation is a subcomputation of the other. That's not the sense of containment in which senses contain modes of presentation. I just want to contrast that with the sense in which neither the function nor the argument are parts of or contained in the value. The relation between them is different. Yeah, John?
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to individuate fatas, and it looks like if you write g parentheses f parentheses a, as you did on the board, there are two fatas, at least, that you could get out of this. One is where you take as function g an argument f of a, and the other one is where you take as argument g of f, like the composition, and smart is you take the function of composition and the argument a. And I'm wondering, is this
absolutely, and that's the key to the next step. That's the key to getting us to senses. Suppose we write his favorite example from the function concept essay, that expression. And now say, well, what is the mode of presentation of that? Well, what function applied to argument gives us, we know that that's, we know that that equals 16. That's a different mode of presentation. Maybe you can think of that as the result of applying the successor of operation to an initial an initial value, but never mind what the numerals are. We've got this expression. Well, we can think about this as the result of applying the function 2 to the x to 4. That's one fata. Or we can think of it as applying the function y to the 4th to 2. Or we can think of it as applying the function y to the x to 2 and 4. All of those are modes of presentation that are part of the sense of that expression. In the concept and object essay, he says, this will be surprising, he's talking about something related, only to somebody who fails to see that a thought can be split up in many ways, so that now one thing, now another, appears as the subject or predicate. That is, the sense of an expression like that consists of all the functional decompositions of it, all the ways in which it can be split up into a function and an argument, or a set of arguments, so as to have the value of this expression, the value, the deutung that is presented here is 16. It's the same. Whether you break it down into functionally this way, or this way, or this way, remember, this was the insight at the center of Macbeth's first book, that what's special about the Begriffsschrift notation is that it presents this in a way that you can see all the functional decompositions of it, which, if we do it in linear notation, we have to split up. It shows all the modes of presentation of the Bedeutung of this expression. So my second interpretive suggestion, this is what John already took this step in his question, that the second interpretive suggestion is that we identify the sense of an expression with all of the functional decompositions of it, all the functions we can see applied to arguments that yield the same value. And remember, he tells us how to do functional analysis, how to use a functional scalpel, a substitutional scalpel, to discern a function. We treat some portion of this as replaceable, and so are thinking of it as being an element of an equivalence class of expressions. This one, we can apply 2 to the x to other things as well. The function is, or corresponds to, all the different things we can get from this by substituting something else in the x position, some other argument for that. And that's going to be different from the y to the 4th applied to 2, because that's going to have 3 to the 4th, for instance, as one of its substitutional variants. So we can think of this expression as belonging to a bunch of different equivalence classes. All the ones you can get by substituting something for 2, all the ones you can get by substituting something for 4, and all the ones you can get by substituting something for both of them. And it's that constellation of modes of presentation that is a Phrygian sense, I want to say. And so the sense, just the set of those, well, it's a structured set because there's relations among them, right? All the instances of this equivalence class are also instances of this equivalence class, and they're what you get if you conjoin these two, just union these two equivalence classes. So there's a structure. It's not just a set, but I'm suggesting it consists in this constellation of modes of presentation. You can think of it as a set if you acknowledge that then there's relations between the functions involved in it. So I claim that these two moves, understanding modes of presentation as computations, as functions applied to arguments, thoughtas, and then thinking of senses as consisting of all the functional decompositions of this expression, together with the arguments that go with that, all the ways of splitting this up into a function and an argument, which, he said, the division between subject and predicate is cutting at the wrong joints for logic. What we want is the senses of these things. We want to think about all the functional decompositions of this. Yes?
Then how can you understand the sense of properties?
Well, he understands them as disguised definite descriptions. I mean, he doesn't make a big deal out of this in a footnote on sense and reference. He says, well, I might associate a different mode of presentation with the name Aristotle. So, you associate it with, I think he says, the philosopher from Stagira, or the most famous student of Plato, or as the teacher of Alexander, or whatever. There's a whole constellation of functions applied to arguments that give you that value, and his thought was for the primitive expressions, we want to say, he says, well, there's going to be concepts, so functions, that pick them out in the way definite descriptions do. I'm only so far talking about the senses. So far I've only talked about the senses of singular terms, but you can see that a corresponding thing is going to happen for the functions, because you can decompose more complex expressions by substituting for the simple predicates as well as for the singular terms. But yes, how does it get off the ground? What are the sort of primitive contacts with the Bedeutung? And that's a road he doesn't go down. He doesn't ask that question. You got to start a computation with something. Well, let me suggest where we can go from here. Third step. So first one, mode of presentation, is functions applied to arguments, that is computations of the Bedeutung that it's a mode of presentation of as the value that results from applying that function to that argument. Second of all, the point he's been making since the Begriffsschrift, and as I say, Macbeth showed us how important that is and how to read the Begriffsschrift that way. One expression is subject to a whole lot of functional decompositions, substitutional decompositions into function and argument, even as simple an expression as this. And we can see if we're now talking about this whole expression, this expression designates the true, but there's different ways of computing this, there's different ways of computing this. Because this is true, they're all modes of presentation of the same Bedeutung, namely 16, So all those decompositions on both sides are modes of presentation of the true. Okay, so modes of presentation as functions applied to arguments, that is computations, is the first move. Second move is saying, yeah, and he's taught us since the Begriffsschrift that expressions can be substitutionally carved up into functions applied to arguments in multiple ways. And the aim of Begriffsschrift is to show all of those, to show the senses of these expressions, that is to show the structured set of all the decompositions of this into modes of presentation of the very same thing. If this has a Bedeutung, then all the ways of carving it up have to be functions applied to arguments that have the same value, have to be different ways of computing the same value. And he's saying a perspicuous notation is going to show you all of those decompositions. That's what the two-dimensional Begriffsschrift is supposed to do. And again, Macbeth is the one who teaches us how to read it that way. Third move in the interpretation is the observation that if you want to know the inferential role of this, what you want is its sense. Because each of these functional decompositions corresponds to a pattern of inference that it's involved in. Now, if it's construed as raising 2 to the application of raising 2 to some power, exponentiation, as applied to 4, then the pattern that it's being assimilated to, the function that it's being seen as instance of, is this set of sentences, all the ones that raise 2 to some power. And there's going to be things that follow from the value being computed that way. For instance, it's true that each one of these things is identical to 2 times 2 times 2 argument number of times. That's if we decompose it this way. And that complex predicate stands in inferential relations to other complex predicates. A group of conclusions that you can draw from premises of this form that goes with its being this form. Those are going to be made explicit in quantified conditionals that relate exponentiation to a certain exponent to multiplication of that base exponent number of times. But if we see it instead as raising something to the 4th power, we get a different complex predicate, a different set of substitutional variants of it, and that set stands in inferential relations to other sets. Again, what we're going to make explicit with quantified conditionals. So each one of these decompositions corresponds to a pattern of inferences that you can make, precisely because the functions are really the predicates now. The predicates are what stand in relations like this. These functions, predicates, have to be complex predicates. Remember, that's where we came in with this. It's the complex predicates that stand in the inferential relations in the first instance. Well, each of these modes of presentation is the discrimination of a complex predicate. And because there are facts like this, everything that walks moves, if you can distinguish something as the application of the walks function to something, it's a concept, so the value is going to be a truth value, then you know that the inference to the application of the walks predicate to that same argument is going to follow from it as a consequence. So the third point is, senses thought of this way determine the inferential roles, determine the inferences that this expression is involved in. And mind you, Frege proves already in the Begriffsschrift that he's codified all the inferences that these things are involved in. Well, all the ones that hold in virtue of its logical form, but that's true for, really complicated expressions. So, we can form this quantificational expression and conjoin something in here. If we put h of y as a conjunct here, then this whole thing, instead of being the name of a truth value, is another concept. Y is a free variable in it, and so it's a property that things can have. And then we could quantify over that. In the Begriffsschrift, he codifies all the good inferences of this sort. And what he spent the rest of his life doing, basically, we're seeing the mature result of that, is trying to understand what he'd done and how it worked. And his story is, well, these things have senses which contain modes of presentation of the Bedeutungen. And for some purposes, you just care about the values, but if you actually want to understand the expression, grasp its inferential role, well, it isn't about grasping it. To determine the inferential role, you need to look at all the functional decompositions of the expression. So the fourth step then is to say, and that inferential role is the cognitive value. When in the very first paragraph of One Sense and Reference, A equals A and A equals B are obviously statements of differing cognitive value. Well, notice they have different senses, different functional decompositions here. One of them's only decomposable as functions of A, and there isn't any B in there to substitute for. The other one does. Well, statements of the form A equal B often contain very valuable extensions of our knowledge. The discovery that the rising sun is not new every morning, but always the same, was one of the most fertile astronomical discoveries. The word he uses is folgenreich, rich in consequences, which is exactly the term Kant uses in his Logic to talk about synthetic things. Eines des folgenreichsten, one of the richest in consequences discoveries. Well, what? infer what's the difference in inferential role of these. Well,
Here's some info about what's the difference.
I'm really sorry about that. No heckling from the disembodied, please. Suppose, he said for inferential role when he first introduced it, he said two things have the same begrifflich Inhalt, conceptual content, if when combined with certain other things, they always have the same consequences. That is, we're looking in effect at the function from collateral hypotheses, auxiliary hypotheses, to the conclusions that you can get. Well, suppose we combine this with P of A. Well, from this you can get P of A. Well, you can still get P of A from this, but you can also get P of B. Identities are intersubstitution licenses. You can get a consequence, P of B, here, that you can't get licensed by this identity. This one, combined with this premise anyway, is rich in consequences. You get something new that you didn't have before. Because A and B are now intersubstitutable in all contexts. That's what the identity licenses. Cognitive value just is a matter of what follows from it if you add it as a premise. It's not a psychological matter at all. It's a question of what really follows from it. Now, of course, there's a sense in which, if this is true, then substituting B for A is never going to change the truth value of anything. So you could ignore the difference in sense that you have here if all you care about is truth. But if you care about what follows from what, then you see that this has a different role as a premise. It combines with other premises to yield different conclusions, new conclusions. This, remember at the very beginning I had the kite of conceptual novelty. This is where the notion of conceptual novelty comes in. This is relating two different modes of presentation, which are not modes of presentation of the same sense. Right? There's a big difference between the constellation of modes of presentation that are contained in this expression, all of which are guaranteed to have the same value, to be modes of presentation of the same Bedeutung. But if you take two modes of presentation like the morning star and the evening star, and now you say those have the same Bedeutung, that's a substantive identity, not something you can read off by just inspecting the senses of the expression. That's why you get something new when you can form an identity from expressions that have senses whose modes of presentation do not overlap. Which is going to be true of this and this as well. These two will share this form, but not these forms. So you get whatever inferences you get for this, but the inferences involving this and this are going to be different. So if we look at modes of presentation that belong to the same sense, we get, we get our notion of sense. If we look at modes of presentation that belong to different senses, then we get a substantive synthetic potential addition to our knowledge, well, all that means is you can draw conclusions that you couldn't draw before. It's an extension of our knowledge. If we know that P of A, well, then yes, you could know that P of B, but the knowledge really isn't what matters. What matters is whether it follows, just from the senses of the expressions. And that's the analysis of the substantive character of identities of the form A equals B, if they have different senses, as opposed to things that have all the same modes of presentation on both sides of the identity claim. So, I mean, parenthetically, if and insofar as this is what's going on in Frege, when Putnam says meanings ain't in the head, well, Frege really wasn't talking about these things being in anybody's head. But you can also see why the sort of puzzle that Putnam or anybody sort of our time would have. Well, we think of the intention as needing a parameter. It's the sense plus the way the world is, plus the facts, that determines what you're referring to by this. What is the watery stuff? Is it H2O or is it XYZ? Just the intention won't tell you that. You need to know sort of what world or what index you're evaluating it at. But that's not how Phrygian senses work. Phrygian senses include not only the function, but the argument. The things you're applying the function to, everything necessary for the computation of the value is already in the sense. So I claim that this model, it uses only materials that Frege has put on the table for us. We're familiar with all these things. And you can read what he says about senses and see, well, on the phantom blackboard, we had senses, one of them, a matter of intersubstitutability, saving cognitive value. I said, that's salva consequentiae. If you combine it with the same other premises, the same things follow from it. And it contains modes of presentation of the Bedeutung. Well, yes, that's exactly what you need in order to determine what actually follows from it when it's combined with certain other things. Yeah, John.
So I'm trying to figure out what the modes of presentation contained in the primitive senses are. So what is the mode of presentation? So we have like some logically proper names, such as the numeral 2, I suppose. And that's supposed to express a sense which contains a mode of presentation of the number 2. But I'm wondering what function and argument are in this mode.
Well, I mean, I suggested that the numerals were really piano successor numerals.
Okay, then not
it's a
number 0
function. And of course, Frege's story in the Grundlagen is somewhat different from that. It's the number of the extension. We put them in one-to-one correspondence and abstract up, introduce the number this way. Well, but abstraction is applying a function to arguments. That's how anything that's introduced by abstraction is introduced by applying a function that uses substitution to get an equivalence relation and then introduces the sortal term and the things under it on the model of directions of a line. Now that isn't a direct response to your question, because okay, that's starting with stuff. We got to have directions and parallel in order to get all that stuff. What does he say? What's the bottom level? Where's it starting?
Yeah, I guess the question is, I mean, there are kind of two questions here. One is like, what informative things can we say about the bottom level? But that's not really my question. My question is instead, what kinds of modes of presentation is it even possible for there to be at this bottom level? Because it seems that the mode of presentation has to be a function applied to an argument, but then it seems, well, if we're decomposing into this function argument, then it would seem like we need to decompose these function arguments.
So, as he's writing these essays, he's writing the Grundgesetze, which we haven't read yet, but it starts off with the true and the false. Well, it starts off, the true is the course of values of the function not identical to itself. Sorry, the false is the course of values of not identical to itself. And the true is the course of values of the function is identical to itself. And he says identity is a universal intersubstitution license. So for any function, you can substitute the one for the other. And this says you can't substitute it for itself to get the false. Somehow that's more intuitive to me. And he's going to build all the concepts of arithmetic out of that. Now you say, well, you're sort of quantifying over all the functions there, but functions, are defined so they have to have values for arguments, even if the value is only the false, which, since he doesn't have a notion of an ill-formed sentence, they just, if the argument is the wrong kind for this function, it just names the false for him. So there's a kind of quantification over all the functional contexts, but he's letting that be prospective. We're stipulating that whatever context there are, if x equals y, then you can intersubstitute them in those contexts. And I'm going to build up these contexts, but I just start off with identities. Now, it turns out there's some slight problems with quantifying over all those things that you might introduce. The Russell paradox becomes formulable if you do that, and we'll look at the way he tries to do that. But yeah, his logic can lift itself by its own bootstraps on this account, he thinks. So look, the sort of question you're asking is exactly the way one should probe a model like this. How much sense can you make of what Frege says, particularly where it's otherwise puzzling what he says, if you think about it this way? A paradigm might be if you were sort of puzzled by incomplete objects being the Bedeutungen of incomplete expressions, and incomplete things are objects with holes in them. And you say, no, think about what other expressions this is being assimilated to the equivalence class. And that puzzling thing that Frege says will be less puzzling. This is supposed to unpuzzle these questions about senses, about Sinne, which is not to say it doesn't raise other ones. There's one more point I want to make this time round, and that's shifting over to the Bedeutung side. It's sort of still there. So, on the one hand, we introduce the new sortal concept, Bedeutung, and we do it by abstraction from expressions. and we say two expressions have the same Bedeutung, now that's going to be an equivalence relation. It's got to be turned into an identity, just in case substituting one for the other never changes the truth value of any expression that they occur in. So the direction of a line, the Bedeutung of an expression, they're both introduced by abstraction. We introduce this new sortal concept, Bedeutung, with the criteria of identity and individuation of that sortal inherited from the more concrete things that we start with. So these two expressions have the same Bedeutung. Really, it's the senses of those expressions that have the same Bedeutung, but have two lines having the same direction, just in case they stand in this equivalence relation, that substituting one for the other never changes the truth value of any sentence in which they occur. So Bedeutungen are introduced by abstraction. The name bearer model of Bedeutungen says the Bedeutung of Fido is the dog. It's the object we're talking about, the bearer of the name. Fido is not an abstract object. Bedeutungen are introduced by abstraction. All Bedeutungen can be specified by abstraction. And yet, for at least some of them, they're true identities relating those terms introduced by abstraction with concrete objects in the causal order, like Fido the dog. Remember when we were first talking about introducing items by abstraction, expressions by abstraction, introducing sortals and singular terms by abstraction, I said there's a substantive step to be taken if you say, well, this expression was introduced by abstraction, so it refers to an abstract object. That is, you're making a substantive move, a potentially controversial move, if you move from how an expression with this referent is introduced, it's introduced by abstraction, to saying there's a kind of thing such that they're abstract objects, that's ones you can only introduce by abstraction, or only come to know about by abstraction. And I pointed out the parallel example of Sellers saying the instrumentalist mistake is to think that a methodological or epistemic difference between things we can observe and things we can only find out about by inference, things we can only find out about by inference are theoretical objects. To think that theoretical objects are a kind of object. But we can introduce a name for a planet by inference. This other planet has a wobbly orbit, and you could explain that if there were a planet of this mass here, but we can only find out about it inferentially, but then we get a better telescope and we can see it. And it didn't change from one kind of object to another. The distinction between theoretical and observable objects is a methodological one, not an ontological one. It has to do with our access to them, not with the kind of thing it is. I said the idea that you can infer from the way we know it to the kind of thing that it is, that's the Platonic principle. That's where he started off and said, well, there's things you can know about through the senses and things you can know about through the intellect, and those are different kinds of things, sensible things and intelligible things. Sometimes you can understand things you can sense. Sometimes you can sense things you can understand. That Platonic principle, I don't say it's never true, but for every kind of knowledge or methodological access, every way of getting to refer to something, to talk and think about it, If you want to erect that into an ontological distinction, there's a substantial job of work to be done. Frege is not committed to there being a kind of thing that is abstract objects. Having said that, I think he does think there are abstract objects. Numbers, for instance. But the fact that an expression is introduced by abstraction does not make it one of those objects. If you can do it sort of purely with logical methods, then you can get a purely abstract object. I mean, that's the way I would read him. As we can see, the Bedeutung of all of our ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, those Bedeutungen, those are as concrete as anything is. They're dogs and electrons and stars and stuff. But when we identify them with the mode of presentation, it's the Bedeutung of this expression, we're introducing them by abstraction. So, I said, again, we have these two, we have a bifurcation between sense and Bedeutung, and within each of them we have a way of introducing the senses and the Bedeutung by abstraction, observing the invariance under substitution, under intersubstitution, in the one case of inferential role, and in the other case of truth value. But we also have another way into them. Senses contain modes of presentation of Bedeutungen, and the name bearer model that says the Bedeutung of expressions is what we're talking about, the things we're referring to with them. And I suggested a way of resolving this, showing the connection between these two sides. If you start with the computational notion of mode of presentation and take on board Frege's observation that expressions can be functionally decomposed in different ways, then we can see the sense of expressions as structured constellations of modes of presentation. And we're not just waving our hands. We can say what the sense of this expression, what the modes of presentation are of this expression. And furthermore, when we look at Frege's notation, and if we see it through the spectacles that Macbeth has given us, we can see that he specifies the Bedeutungen of all of the logical expressions. So every expression in Begriffsschrift in the Grundgesetze has a Bedeutung, and you can always compute the Bedeutung, the truth value of any sentence in it from the truth values of others, or say that, but it does that by showing us, by displaying the senses, by writing the expressions in a way that makes evident, perspicuous, what the functional decompositions of it are. So what are the computations that are relevant for determining the inferential role of it? Senses in that sense are never referred to by any expression of Grundgesetze, but we can see the senses. It makes them perspicuous. Now, I can't help but think that understanding of Frege's notation has got to be in the young Wittgenstein's mind when he's talking about the difference between saying and showing, that his senses can only be shown, not said. That what a sentence and the fact that it pictures have in common, in virtue of which it's a picture of that, is something that can only be shown and not said. I mean, I think the Fregean picture is much more articulated. The sense of sense that is shown by his notation is vastly more expressively powerful than what's shown by the Tractarian picture. And of course, Wittgenstein came to see that this was merely a shadow, a projection of something much richer than that. The very projection that Tarskian model theory then gave a full account of. So this, I think, is Frege's mature meta-vocabulary for thinking about the contentfulness of expressions. At its core is the notion of observing invariance under substitution. And that idea was the master idea, the leading idea of Bernard Bolzano more than 50 years before Frege is doing this. Frege not influenced by it, nobody was, it was only becoming known. But for next time, we're going to take a little vacation from Frege and look at what Bolzano did with that idea, how he framed it. He's also looking at invariance of truth values. Truth value is not quite right, but truth is what is invariant in his scheme, and he wants to get a notion of consequence out of that. In Frege's sense, he's not really doing logic, but he's doing semantics. And I at least find it he's a very good philosopher, as well as being sort of more famous as a mathematician and physicist than he was as a philosopher, even though the same sort of thing. But he was actually the first one who proved the intermediate value theorem, that if a continuous function has a positive value somewhere and a negative value somewhere, then it has a zero value somewhere in between those, which Frege uses as one of his examples in Begriffsschrift. The Theorem 133 is on its way to the intermediate value theorem. Anyway, it's a completely different setup, but it has the same core idea. And Bolzano was the first one to give a definition of consequence in general, and it was in terms of substitution. So, I think it's worth looking at this as a comparison as we think about Frege. But Frege already has this rich scheme which gets boiled down. If you only think about the objects, not about the functions, and you only think about the Bedeutung and not the Sinne, then you get Tarski and Quine. Our grandparents, that's what you get. We've begun to worry about these other issues. One thing that Bolzano worries about that Frege doesn't much, though I think he has things we can learn from him, is if you tell the story about senses the way I do, the way I have here, you can understand the relation to Bedeutung so you can understand the relation between senses and Bedeutungen that's epitomized in the statement that senses contain modes of presentation of their Bedeutungen. That's the sense in which senses determine reference. But the question that remains is, how do you need to use an expression to make it express a particular sense? And surely that's going to have to do with what you assert and how you reason with it, how substitution goes with. But exactly how do you have to do that? He gives us a complete answer to that question for purely logical expressions, which for him goes all the way up to numbers, in the Grundgesetze, which after our vacation in Bolzano land we'll come back and begin to look at the things he says about what he's doing in the mature period here. But in the meantime, I hope it'll just be a pleasure to read the Bolzano. I put on the website sort of what seemed to me the key passages. I haven't yet put which sections of the book. I linked to the English translation of the book. The whole thing has not been translated, but we've got big chunks of it now. The whole thing didn't even get published in German until 20 years ago. But you can see from which are the key sections from the references in the key passages that I gave you. I will update the website as well, but you can already tell that. And before you, if you want to read those passages before you wade into the book to sort of get the motivation, that's sort of why they're there. So that's for next time. Thank you.
Thank you.